All right, call the RSO at the embassy.
The challenge was to start and finish this new Miniart RSO over a weekend so I could bring you this build review. And if any of you are familiar with Miniart kits, you could probably consider that a little ambitious. But I like a challenge, so I've committed to this 48 in 48 group build, raising funds for Models for Heroes, and if you don't know about that, I'd encourage you to check it out. I'll leave a link down below. I've been lucky enough to receive what I believe is the first review kit here in Australia, and I'll be doing a review through the Modelling News. An initial quick look at the parts in the box certainly didn't raise any concerns, with the detail and the moulding seeming to be of a very high quality. In particular, there are some delicate welds moulded around some of the parts that are probably hard to detect unless under magnification, but it's there nonetheless. I'm going to sideline a few of my other builds just to get on top of this one and build it immediately for you. And I thought it'd be fun to drop a few timestamps and little video clips to document the journey I took, so keep an eye out for those. The build order you are seeing will not exactly be in chronological order, but it just made sense for the video to flow a little better, so please bear that in mind. I've also got a bit of a surprise announcement to make once I begin the painting with this one, so be sure to stick around and check that one out. So a Miniart build over a weekend, what do you reckon? Am I dreaming? We're about to find out. Let's get started.
You're dreaming, Batman.
Because I've set myself against the clock for this one, this build is going to be about efficiencies. So the first thing I do is make my way through the instructions and write in the color callouts that are noted at each stage. Unfortunately, there were a few color numbers called out that were not allowed for in that list of colors, but it was nothing that couldn't be worked around. I begin by clipping as many of the identifiable parts off the sprues as I can and start making my way around them, removing the connection points using a sharp blade and a sanding stick. I immediately noticed how soft the plastic was, so care had to be taken not to gouge and damage it when I was using the blade. The chassis section is the first part of the build, and this will form the foundations of that vehicle. The instructions suggest fitting the cross sections first, but I found it was easier to fit the sidewalls first, as that helped the bracing find their positions. The fit wasn't the best, and a bit of muscle was required to squeeze them together, and there was a small gap between some of the parts on the underside that would require filling, but that would need to be addressed at a later date because the clock was ticking. There are a number of protruding pieces that need to be removed from the top edge of that chassis rail, so make sure you have your wits about you when you remove them to make sure you're removing the correct ones, as there is one that needs to remain, at least on this version of the RSO. The tool shown in step 5 has no defined position, so I left that off just in case it would impact the build at a later stage. It's also worth mentioning I found the location points of the engine mounts to be highly confusing, so I left them off at this stage. I worked it out a little later on in the build, and I'm showing you on screen what they should look like, so for your own reference take notes because this is what they should look like. Continuing with the sub-assemblies, and the kit comes with a highly detailed little engine. My hope was to pose that front hatch open so I could get a look at it, so I wanted to give this the attention it deserved. It was built to a point where it could be base coated and then set aside, as too with a fuel tank and the exhaust pipe. Further detail was added to that exhaust by using a micro drill to drill out the end of the pipe, and then the assembly was enhanced with a Tamiya putty thinned with a modelling cement, and then stippling it all over the part with an old brush. This will create a nice surface and give the look of a heat affected, rust affected exhaust pipe when it comes time to paint. The drive sprockets and idlers were prepared for paint also, and I could move on to the cabin assemblies. The doors come together in two halves, and the way it's made represents that pressed sheet metal, hollow style of door really nicely. There is also the option to have the window up or half down, but I left them off until after the paint. So about 4.5 hours in, and I'm nowhere near where I thought I was going to be with this. It's quite a time-consuming build. Working on a lot of sub-assemblies, trying to be efficient with how I'm building so I can get all my painting done in the morning, but we will see how we go. It's 1:15 in the morning. So I'll get up and we'll hit it again come tomorrow. The cabin interior is broken into two halves, the passenger side and the driver side with the controls, and then they connect to the rear wall that has had some smaller details like an extinguisher and blinds added to it. The cavity between those two halves will be the space where that engine will hopefully nest in between. I could then prime that interior in a Mr. Surfacer red oxide colour, and that's mainly because I'd run out of my usual black. So once primed, I paint the whole assembly in a black lacquer base. The instructions give you an option for the interior colour. It's either a sand or a light blue or an RLM 78 without any explanation, and I tried to find some information around these colours, but I didn't come up with much other than the interior would most probably have been painted to match the exterior. And I know that sounds logical, but given it was calling out a light blue and the exterior would be dark grey, it sort of wasn't really adding up. I was painting from that black base, so I split the difference and made a mix of RLM 78 and dark grey and started applying the colour, letting that black base influence the finish. I could then move back through and start adding highlights using the RLM 78. That colour was nowhere near as blue as I thought it might be and ended up giving me an interesting base tone to work with. The same techniques were used on the other elements from the interior, like the dash and those beautiful door skins. And playing with those tones of blue-grey and adding highlights is such an enjoyable thing to do and should help present this cabin in an interesting way. It was then just a matter of picking out details with acrylic paints and a fine brush. I'm trying not to get too caught up with the detail painting in this area because it's going to be so hard to see on the finished model, and I'm just trying to move through the build swiftly. The details received a dry brush using a pale grey acrylic, and then finally an enamel pin wash was applied using blue-brown. The dry brushing should catch and highlight the raised areas, and the wash will give the details depth. It's all about expanding that range from highlight to shadow to create volume in those parts. The clear pieces of the front windscreen can be glued in place here, and I carefully let the extra thin cement migrate around the gaps to hold it in place against the styrene surround. And I know I harp on about it, but modelling cement can destroy your clear parts, so great care must be taken when using this method. PVA glue is a good alternative for your clear parts, but because I needed this build to move quickly, I didn't have time to wait for that to dry, hence I used modelling cement and kept my fingers crossed. Back to the chassis, and the rails for that suspension system have a small etched guard that needs to be bent and fitted. There is no folding template, however the way it should sit should be reasonably easy to work out. The rails could then be glued in place, and you may notice the rear axle is also in place, as is that toe point. The kit gives you the choice when it comes to that tow bar, so be sure to check which one is most appropriate for the example you are trying to build, if that was important to you. The instructions call out for that chassis to be finished in a red-brown, which I assume is Miniart's interpretation of the red oxide primer. I have that Mr. Surfacer rattle can red oxide primer, so out the back I went for a spray session, and the chassis with the fuel tank was installed and it was painted in that colour and ready to go. So about an hour and a half into day 2 of this build, I've got some most of the sub-assemblies done, and got some primer down and whatnot on the chassis side of things.
about to start painting the engine, but so far so good. So I'm about 5.5, 6 hours into this build, plugging away.
The wheels had been primed in the last few drops of Mr. Surfacer Black I had, and then the grey colour was created with a mix of dark grey and white. Again, I'm letting that dark primer influence the colour, and I'm purposely painting light because I know the weathering will deepen everything up once it comes time to apply it. Once those wheels are dry, they're super glued to those arms and then glued to the side rails of that suspension system. By seating the model on a flat surface, I can ensure the wheels are all touching the ground and the model is sitting flat. Like a lot of kits these days, the model comes with the Lincoln length style of track. After the pieces have been removed and any connection points cleaned up, I can create small lengths of the track using Tamiya Extra Thin through those joints. After a few minutes, I can then roll those small lengths around the drive sprockets and they should hold their shape somewhat. Then I can just start piecing in the other lengths. As each joint dries, I can add another length until I have that whole bottom run assembled. I can then dry fit that length to the model and then inlay the top section. I'm building these tracks so they can be removed to be painted. You might have seen me pre-paint these previously, but the plastic was so soft in this kit, I didn't want to risk adding paint to that and compromising the joints, so I chose to do it like this. One of the other elements that most excited me with this kit was the engine and the possibilities it created with displaying this model. Now, my knowledge of the RSO is limited at best, but after looking at images of them in the field, it looks like the cabin could be removed for the soldiers to work on the engine. And that could make for an interesting diorama or display for those of you wishing to take that on. I painted the engine block in a dark grey as my base layer, and then using a dry brushing technique with the ammo gunmetal acrylic, I was able to introduce those gunmetal tones as well as add some variation to that finish. Details could then be painted in using aluminium and black acrylic paints, and painting with acrylics often takes multiple thinned passes, so please be a little more patient than I was during this build and you will get a better coverage than I did. The fans at the top of the engine block received sponge chipping with a NATO brown, and the exhaust was painted in a similar way using that sponge chipping technique. The section will be enhanced with washers at a later stage, well at least that was the plan, and was squeezed into that chassis assembly.
3 hours in on day 2, still chipping away, starting to do some detail painting like the engine that's going to be dropped into the chassis, and started working on the interior of the cabin. So going to do some detail painting now. It's about, what was it, 4 hours through, I'm about 7 hours in. At least I'm getting some paint down. It's a nice change of scenery.
The fit again is extremely tight and required some gentle persuasion to nestle it in place. And it was here I got the impression the engine was going to be all but impossible to see through that front hatch, and the couple of hours I'd spent on it might have been for nothing. But that aside, I airbrushed some darker tones with a heavily thinned mix of red, brown and black. And this is thinned to around 90% thinner to paint and should be tinting and staining that red oxide colour rather than changing the colour of it. Most of this will soon be lost under trays and cabins, but I also took the opportunity to apply a black and a dark brown panel line wash with the Tamiya panel liner, mainly because they were just quicker and easier to use. They are, however, a little harder to clean up than some of the other enamel washes I regularly use, but nothing a cotton bud moistened with white spirit couldn't handle. I'd noticed chipping on some reference images around the wheels, so I added that detail again with the sponge, and then the tracks were painted in Tamiya iron, and once dry they could be carefully angled and glued in place, and then with a touch of super glue I can connect those two ends of the track. Back to the cabin, and one of the things I was concerned about was the way these pieces had to lock together to make the overall shape of it. The floor section was quite problematic actually, and took some less than gentle persuasion to clip it in place. But once it found its happy place, I sealed the deal with super glue because of the speed the super glue will set off. I didn't want to risk the pressure of that joint with modeling cement, so I just went with the super glue. The rear wall and the front face are now bridged together with the roof section, and again the super glue ensures a strong and fast bond to hold it in place. And then the modeling cement can be run through the rest of the joint to help it meld together.
Well, good morning everyone. It's Sunday morning, 10 a.m. I managed to get another 3 hours done last night, so I'm up to 12 hours total now. Engine fitted, tracks on, cabin assembled. So let's push on. It's going to be tight, but we'll see how far I can get along.
The joints through that roof meant some filling and sanding would be required to hide them. I did this with black super glue mainly because I knew it would dry fast and be easy to sand. A small piece of tape was applied to protect the detail on that roof, and the part was set aside for the glue to set. In the meantime, that canvas cover for the rear was assembled. The front is clearly molded in the underside of the part. It will be all but impossible to see, but it's something you might want to address with your own model. The joints are again pretty prominent here as well, so this was assembled and treated to the black super glue and set aside for an hour to dry. Moving to the tub now, and whilst the part looked okay, I felt it could use a little help by better representing the grain in the timber. I'm using a riveting tool here, but there is nothing stopping you using a razor saw or possibly even a pin to create these timber textures. By dragging those serrated teeth in a non-structured way, I'm able to scribe the plastic and create a timber grain in those parts. I'm careful not to damage the parts that make up the metal sections of the framework of that tray. Once done, I give it a light sand to remove any fluff from the plastic, and then I can use a scriber to reintroduce the plank detail the riveting tool might have damaged. A quick brush with a Tamiya extra thin modeling cement removes all of that styrene dust and debris, and just like that the detail has leveled up, and looking at them side by side there is clearly no comparison. With all the sides textured, I could then assemble that box tray and prime it all. The super glue had had time to dry, and the targeting sanding could take place. A tool like this reciprocating sander makes light work of a job like this, and if you're interested in one, I've left a link and a discount in the show notes down below. The instructions call out for a length of wire to go on the rear of that cabin that would need to be cut and bent into shape. This doesn't come with the kit, and honestly is a big ask for the average modeler to be able to execute something like this. It looks to be an air outlet or something like that from the fuel tank, and it's a nice detail, but with no bending pattern or diagram, you're kind of left to your own devices to work it out. I did the best under the time constraints I was working with, so it was far from perfect, but for the limited vision this detail will get on the finished model, I think it'll be good enough. It was then time to prime, so the clear parts were masked using a VMS latex mask. I could have used tape here to mask the windows up, but I would have had to cut on the plastic, and that is never a great idea. The canvas, tray and cabin were all then primed in Mr. Surfacer 1200 grey, again because I was out of the black. Now here's where things got a bit exciting for me, and hopefully for you guys too. Gaahleri is a relatively new to the market airbrush manufacturer, and they have kindly sent me one of their new Moebius 0.2mm airbrushes to trial on this build. And I'm not going to do a dedicated airbrush review because quite frankly, there are loads of them online and there is nothing I can say that hasn't been said already. So I'm going to use it and put it to the test here on this model, although the camouflage application will be its true test, but that will be for another time. I started the paintwork with some soft pre-shading around the recesses of the tarp. Creating realistic looking tarps and materials can be tricky, so I'm going to try and enhance the folds and the creases using these shading techniques. The suggested colour is absent from the colour list, so I chose XF49 Khaki as my deepest tone, and I applied a somewhat misted layer over the section. By keeping the paint thin to around 70% thinner to paint and misting it on, I'm able to allow that shading to show through, representing shadowed tones through those folds. Adding buff to the mix and then focusing that lightened colour on the high points of the folds and where the supports are implied underneath it can enhance that dimensional nature of the moulding. The cabin and tray are now painted in a dark grey, and I'm not bothering with my usual mottled style because of the camouflage I've planned for the next stage of the build. But while you're watching, I'd like to share some exciting news for my next giveaway.
Holy giveaways, Batman.
Gaahleri has generously given me a GAD39 Advanced Series airbrush to give away as a celebration of this build series. I will go into my airbrush experience with this new tool in more depth in the next video, but if my initial testing is anything to go by, I get the feeling I'm on a winner here. So be sure to keep an eye out for the painting and weathering part of this series for your chance to win yourself a brand new Gaahleri airbrush.
So done bits and pieces through the day. I'm up to hour number 16. About to assemble everything. Got the little canvas tarp, trays painted, ready to go, and cabin. There's a lot of little tricky bits in this fella, so I'm hoping to goodness it fits over the engine. Guess we're about to find out. I've probably got about another hour and a half in me today, so I think we'll come pretty close to getting this thing assembled and ready for weathering.
But back to the build, and the cabin should, in theory, just cap over the engine, but the fit is so tight and was feeling obscured by something. I tried to take it off to investigate, but the engine assembly was wedged so tight in that cavity it came out with it, which was not really ideal.
Not ideal.
Turned out it was this small pipe-like part causing the trouble, so I just removed it because you couldn't see it anyway. It was here I actually realised how deep in that front hatch the engine actually sat, and those hours spent on it were pretty much a waste of time that I didn't have. Obviously that's not a Miniart critique, it's just an observation and something you might want to delete from your own model, or at least keep the effort invested in it into a minimum. Unless of course you plan to pose it with the cabin off, and that changes the equation dramatically. So the only thing left to do was to super glue the tray in place and then cap that tarp assembly on the back, and the model was ready for camouflage and the weathering stage. Okay, so I can't call this a finished model, but I think investing 17 hours in a Miniart kit over a weekend deserves some recognition. Plus, we raised some money for a great cause. This kit was always going to be a popular release because a lot of people seem to have a soft spot for this little tractor, and with other versions set to be released, it is going to be a case of choosing which one you want to build or which one you can probably get your hands on. The build for the most part was reasonably straightforward, but may test a few modelers. This is not a kit for the beginner, and the intermediate modeler will need to be cautious around some of those assemblies because it is easy to get caught out. A Miniart kit is a kit you really shouldn't try and rush through, so I probably made life hard for myself because I tried to do that. The cons of the kit were some of the positioning of the parts were open to interpretation, and some of those connection points were overly tight and required a degree of pressure to get them to mate. The three-piece assembly of the cabin just seemed to be overcomplicated to me, meaning that there were going to be seams that needed to be addressed. And missing colour callouts, well, they were annoying, but they certainly weren't a deal breaker. And the wire tubing you need to scratch build might test a few and might be best left off the model. The pros? Well, as I mentioned, this subject is awesome and very usable for those of you building German armour. I was impressed with some of the fine detail in the moulding, like the welds on those wheel arms and the drive sprockets. The link and length tracks were just about perfect, and the cabin interior had a good level of refinement. The engine assembly is a model in itself, and for those of you wanting to wire it up and pose the model with the cabin off, there is a great opportunity to do that with this kit. Overall though, it's a really nice kit that just requires a degree of focus and patience, but there is no doubt it builds into a lovely rendition of an early production Raupenschlepper. As always, thank you to my amazing Patreons, with a special call out to Lysander for going over and above in helping out with details around this vehicle. And thanks to Ted Donnelly for coming on board as my latest killer kangaroo. You guys are making all this possible, and I certainly couldn't be doing it without you. I'm ready now for camouflage and weathering in the next part of this build series, and I'll be giving you the chance to win this lovely Gaahleri airbrush, so be sure you tune in. Hitting that like button makes a huge difference to the success of these videos, so please consider hitting that and subscribing if you haven't already. And remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I will see you soon.
Don't you have a better way to spend the weekend?
No.